APUSH Period 7 Empire and Expansion, U.S. Imperialism 1890 to 1909. By the last decade of the 19th century, America found itself standing at a crossroads, gazing outward in a way it had never fully done before. For a century, expansion had meant pressing westward, over mountains, across rivers, into the vast plains, guided by the spirit of manifest destiny. The frontier was not just a geographical space, but a cultural myth, one that gave Americans a sense of purpose, of challenge, of limitless possibility. Then in 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner announced in his famous thesis that the frontier was closed. What had long defined the nation's growth, what had shaped its democracy, and even its character was gone. Yet Americans were not content to see their destiny end at the shores of the Pacific. Industrial might had made the United States a rising economic giant. Factories poured forth steel and textiles, locomotives and guns, in quantities that dwarfed those of earlier decades. Population growth added millions of new citizens, many of them recent immigrants to the national fabric. Where, Americans asked, would this restless energy be directed? The answer increasingly was outward, to the Pacific and the Caribbean, to markets and territories overseas. The United States turned its gaze. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in American history, the age of imperialism. The closing of the frontier did not mean the closing of American ambition. Indeed, it fueled it. Turner had argued that the frontier bred self reliance and democracy. It gave Americans something to strive toward. Without it, he warned, stagnation might follow. Politicians, businessmen, and intellectuals took this argument to heart. To maintain vitality, America would need new frontiers, not in the West, but abroad. Meanwhile, the 1890s were years of both confidence and anxiety. The panic of 1893 had thrown millions into unemployment, shaking faith in the economy's ability to sustain growth at home. Factories and farms alike produced more than the domestic market could consume. For many leaders, the solution lay in foreign markets, in opening doors abroad for American goods. The decade thus marked a turning point. The United States, once content to secure in its own continent, now began to measure itself against the empires of Europe and to imagine a destiny on the world stage. Why did America, long cautious about entangling itself overseas, begin to pursue empire? The answer lies in a combination of practical needs, strategic concerns, and lofty, sometimes self deceiving ideals. Economics was a powerful driver. Factories and farms churned out a surplus that demanded new outlets. Overseas colonies promised both raw materials and consumers. In this way, imperialism became an extension of industrialization. Strategic and military concerns added urgency. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, in his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1890, argued that no nation could hope to rise to greatness without a mighty navy. He studied Britain's empire and he concluded that sea power was the key to dominance. His words struck a chord in Washington. Policymakers now dreamed of naval bases scattered across oceans, and above all, a canal through Central America to connect the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. Politics and prestige mattered as well. The United States, though powerful, felt the hot breath of competition. Europe carved up Africa with an astonishing speed in the scramble for Africa. Asia, too, was falling under foreign spheres of influence. Americans feared being left behind, condemned to the margins of global affairs. Lastly, ideology. Rudyard Kipling's phrase, the white man's burden, though coined for the British, found eager reception in America. Social Darwinists argued that just as in nature, so too among nations, only the fittest would survive. Reverend Josiah Strong's book, Our Country, proclaimed that Anglo Saxon civilization was destined to uplift and civilize others. It was a message that clothed ambition and virtue. Together, these motives economic, strategic, political, ideological created a momentum few could resist. The Hawaiian Islands became a proving ground for America's new ambitions. Missionaries had arrived in the 1820s intent on converting native Hawaiians to Christianity. They came with Bibles, schools, and an unwavering conviction in their mission. Soon, however, missionaries were joined by planters. Families like the Doles acquired land for sugar and pineapple plantation. By the 1880s, American planters dominated the Hawaiian economy. Strategic concerns followed. In 1887, the U.S. secured rights to a naval base at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii's location in the Pacific was invaluable, a midpoint between Asia and America, a place to refuel and defend America's reach across the ocean. Yet Hawaiians resisted. Queen Lalakalani, ascending to the throne in 1891, believed Hawaii should be governed by Hawaiians. She attempted to restore the monarchy's power, curbing the influence of foreign planters. Her defiance provoked an orchestrated revolt. In 1893, American planters, backed quietly by U.S. Marines, overthrew her. President Grover Cleveland recoiled, rejecting annexation and lamenting the injustice. But the tide of empire proved irresistible. In 1898, amid the fervor of the Spanish American War, Hawaii was annexed. Pearl Harbor would become one of the most important naval bases in the world. Hawaii's story reveals how religion, commerce, and strategy combined to pull America into empire, and how ideals of liberty coexisted uneasily with actions of conquest. Cuba, too, became a crucible of America's imperial ambitions. The island, long under Spanish control, was in ferment. Rebellion after rebellion had broken out in the 19th century. In the 1890s, Spain responded with extraordinary brutality. General Valeriano Weyler, dubbed Butcher Weyler by the American press, forced hundreds of thousands of Cubans into reconcentration camps. Disease and starvation killed tens of thousands. Americans watched with both sympathy and calculation. U.S. investors had poured money into Cuban sugar plantations, making the island's fate inseparable from America's economy. At the same time, newspapers in New York and elsewhere seized on the Cuban struggle to sell papers. Yellow journalism, as it came to be known, exaggerated Spanish atrocities and inflamed public opinion. When a Spanish diplomat, Enrique Dupel de Lome, wrote a letter insulting President McKinley as weak, the press splashed it across the headlines. Insult became outrage, and outrage fed the clamor for war. On the evening of February 15th, 1898, a thunderous explosion ripped through the battleship Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor. The blast tore the ship apart, killing 261 American sailors. The cause was uncertain. Perhaps an external mine, perhaps an internal accident. But the American public did not wait for evidence. The press declared Spain guilty. "Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain!" shouted the headlines. In a climate already thick with suspicion and indignation, the disaster became the final spark. Whether Spain was guilty mattered little. What mattered was that Americans believed it. The Maine's destruction was less a cause than a catalyst, hardening opinion and making war almost inevitable. In April 1898, Congress declared war. Yet to preserve appearances, lawmakers added the Teller Amendment, vowing the United States sought no control over Cuba and that once liberated, Cubans would govern themselves. It was a noble promise, though one soon complicated by events. The war itself was swift. Spain, a faded empire, stood little chance against America's industrial might. But it was also broader than Cuba. In the Philippines, halfway around the world, American ships attacked Spanish forces. What began as a war of liberation in the Caribbean quickly spread into contest for empire in the Pacific. Secretary of State John Hay would call it a splendid little war. It lasted only 4 months. In Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey's squadron obliterated Spain's Pacific fleet without the loss of a single American life. In Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt, already restless in his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigned and led the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry, in the charge up San Juan Hill. Their victory, aided by African American regiments who often go unremembered, became legend. By August, Spain sued for peace. The war's brevity and apparent clarity, fought for freedom, ended in victory, seemed to confirm the righteousness of Americans' cause. Yet beneath the surface lay troubling questions. Liberation and conquest had become entangled, and the Treaty of Paris would force Americans to decide who they wished to be. Signed in December 1898, the Treaty of Paris redrew the map. Spain ceded Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. For the first time, America found itself in the possessions of overseas colonies. It was a moment of triumph, but also of unease. Could a republic found out of liberty hold colonies? Could a people who had once rebelled against empire now become an empire themselves? These were not academic questions. They struck at the heart of America's identity. Senators debated fiercely, and ratification passed by a narrow margin. America, willing or not, had become an imperial power. The aftermath of the war sparked a national soul searching. The Anti Imperialist League, whose included figures as diverse as Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, and Mark Twain, denounced annexation of the Philippines. Twain, with his biting wit, declared that America was betraying its own ideals by subjugating another people. Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines from the government simply to grant them independence. On the other side stood President McKinley and the expansionists, who argued that America had a duty to govern the islands until they were, quote, ready for self rule. The Senate debate required a two-thirds majority, and only by the slimmest of margins did the treaty pass. The choice was made. America would be both a republic and an empire, straining to reconcile the two. Though technically independent after 1902, Cuba remained bound to the United States. The Platt Amendment gave Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever stability seemed threatened. It barred Cuba from treaties that might compromise its independence and ensured a permanent American presence at Guantanamo Bay. For Cubans, this was independence in name but not in reality. The United States, despite its president's promises, had tethered Cuba to its orbit. It was a pattern that would reoccur elsewhere. Liberty proclaimed, yet control maintained. Puerto Rico, seized during the war, occupied an ambiguous status. The Four-Acre Act of 1900 granted limited self-government but withheld full autonomy. Congress later extended citizenship in 1918, yet the island remained without the full rights enjoyed by states. The Supreme Court in the insular cases declared that constitutional rights did not automatically extend to territories. Puerto Rico was, quote, foreign in a domestic sense, as one justice put it. In practice, this meant Puerto Ricans were Americans, but not fully so, a status that persists to this day. It was the empire within the republic. Perhaps the greatest contradiction of all lay in the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo, who had led the Filipino independence movement against Spain, believed the Americans were allies. But when the United States annexed the islands, his hopes turned to bitterness. The Philippine American War erupted in 1899, lasting 3 years and costing hundreds of thousands of lives, most of them Filipino civilians. It was a war of ambushes and reprisals, of guerrilla resistance and harsh counterinsurgency. For Americans who believed they were liberators, it was a sobering lesson. For Filipinos, it was a tragedy. Not until 1946, after World War II, would independence fully come. The Philippines would stand as proof that America's imperial adventure was not always splendid, nor always little. As America expanded, its eyes turned to Asia's greatest prize, China. Other powers, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, had carved China into spheres of influence, each claiming privileged access to ports and markets. American merchants feared exclusion. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay issued the Open Door Notes, declaring that all nations should have an equal trading rights in China. It was a bold assertion for a nation still new to global affairs. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 tested these ambitions. Chinese nationalists, outraged by foreign presence, rose in revolt, besieging foreign legations in Beijing. An international force, including American troops, crushed the uprising. The episode marked America's arrival as a Pacific power, determined to play a role in the balance of Asia. The assassination of President McKinley in 1901 vaulted Theodore Roosevelt, only 42 years old, into the White House. He was the youngest president in American history and among the most energetic. Roosevelt expanded the power of the presidency itself. He believed the president was not merely a steward of the laws, but the nation's chief actor, free to do whatever the Constitution did not forbid in pursuit of the public good. His foreign policy motto, quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," summed up his approach: diplomacy where possible, force where necessary. Roosevelt's style was bold, theatrical, and unapologetic. Under him, the presidency ceased to be a passive office and became the engine of national ambition. Roosevelt's determination found its greatest expression in the Panama Canal. The idea of linking the Atlantic and the Pacific was centuries old. The French had tried and failed, leaving behind ruin and disease. Roosevelt was undeterred. When Colombia rejected a treaty granting the U.S. rights to build, Roosevelt quietly supported a Panamanian revolt. Success followed swiftly, and with the Haye-Bonavilla Treaty, the U.S. secured control of the Canal Zone. Construction, completed in 1914, was an engineering marvel. The canal transformed world trade and the America's power. It allowed the U.S. Navy to shift between oceans in days rather than months. It turned the Caribbean into an American lake, and it symbolized Roosevelt's philosophy. Where others hesitated, he acted. The canal was not only a passage between seas, but a moment to the age of American ascendancy. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 had warned Europe against interference in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt in 1904 added a new corolla. The United States itself had the right to intervene in Latin America to preserve order and stability. The implications were vast. America became, in Roosevelt's words, the international police power of the Western Hemisphere. Marines landed in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Haiti. Banks and railroads fell under American control. To Latin Americans, this was imperialism cloaked in paternalism. To Roosevelt, it was pragmatism, better American intervention than European. The Roosevelt cholera strained relations with Latin America, but also entrenched the United States as the dominant power of the hemisphere. It was empire not in name, but in practice. Roosevelt's reach was global. In 1905, he helped negotiate peace between Russia and Japan after their bloody war, earning a Nobel Peace Prize. Yet his admiration for Japan's modernity was mixed with unease at its growing strength. At home, tensions rose. California passed laws segregating Asian students, sparking outrage in Japan. Roosevelt struck the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, by which Japan agreed to limit immigration while the U.S. promised to ease discriminatory laws. Then came the Great White Fleet. 16 gleaming battleships, painted white, sailed around the world from 1907 to 1909, a floating symbol of America's might. Roosevelt wanted no war, but he wanted all to know America was ready for one. Thus, in East Asia, as in Latin America, Roosevelt left his mark. The United States was no longer a provincial power. It had become a nation whose influence had been felt from Havana to Manila, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The age of American empire had begun. At the dawn of the 20th century, the presidency itself was undergoing transformation. William McKinley, though cautious, led the nation into war with Spain and presided over America's first overseas acquisitions. In the aftermath of his assassination in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt surged the presidency with a vigor and force, reshaping the very office. His successors, William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, though very different in temperament, continued the expansion of Americans' role abroad. Together, these four men marked a decisive shift. Where once the United States had followed Washington's advice to avoid foreign entanglements, and now pursued active engagement with the world. The presidency became the vehicle for that engagement, each man adding his own imprint. McKinley, cautious and deliberate, embodied the late 19th century. Roosevelt, bold and theatrical, ushered in the modern presidency. Taft, lawyerly and methodical, tried to wield influence through commerce, that is, dollar diplomacy. Wilson, the professor turned statesman, cloaked foreign policy in the lofty language of moral purpose. Yet all shared one conviction: America must no longer remain on the sidelines. It had become a global actor, and the office of the president was now its stage. Here ends the video.